Welcome back to Unit 4. In this, we're going to talk about methods and cognitive neuroscience. This video is about the methodologies that cognitive psychology utilizes. If you remember in the previous video, we talked about, in the history of psychology, we talked about how cognitive psychology is formed and what the basic assumptions are. We're going to go over a quick review of the important things that you need to carry on to this unit from the last unit. Also, a quick note that the methods section or the methods part of this particular unit comes from chapter 1 and the cognitive neuroscience part comes from chapter 2. So it's a mix of these two. I put these together because they both talk about methodologies. Coming to quick review of what we did in the last unit when we talked about the history of psychology, we said that, well, the most current perspective is cognitive psychology, and the approach it adapts is called the IP approach. Now, IP here refers to information processing approach. Now, we said that IP approach is the meta theory of cognitive psychology. A meta theory is the basic set of assumptions for any scientific field where we don't ask questions about those assumptions, but we examine the implications of those assumptions. So, the basic assumptions of cognitive psychology are these, as we discussed in the last unit, that mental processes exist, that mental processes can be objectively studied, and humans are information processing systems that we process information. Also, in the last video, we define cognition. If you remember the very first week, where in the big picture, we define cognition as a set of complex mental processes. Well, now we have a more detailed definition of cognition, where it is not just a set of mental processes, a set in the sense a list of mental processes like one, two, three, four, like sensation, perception, attention, right? Cognition now is how these mental processes are working together. So cognition is now defined as the coordinated operation, how they work together, how these mental processes work together. That's what is more important part of defining cognition. So cognition is this coordinated operation of active mental processes. And these mental processes occur within a system, a memory system. And it's a multi-component system, like it has, if you remember from big picture, which is sensory memory, short-term slash working memory, long-term memory. So these coordinated activities of active mental process, such as sensation, perception, attention, they occur in this multiple component memory system. Then we also discussed in the same unit that cognitive psychology adapted IP approach, but strict IP approach to start with, but eventually it changed, made some revisions to IP approach, and the new approach is called the cognitive science approach. Keep in mind that these three basic assumptions or meta theories remain the same even in cognitive science approach. What is different is some specific aspects of the model we will talk about in this particular lecture. And in the last year, we also talked about some general differences between strict IP approach and the cognitive science approach. They are different in multiple ways. Number one, the methodologies adapted are different between these approaches. For instance, the information processing approach only utilizes reaction time and accuracy measures, whereas cognitive science approach adapts multiple methodologies. And we'll talk about what those multiple methodologies are in this particular video. Also, what is different between IP approach and cognitive science approach is that the background of the scientist. And in IP approach, typically it's the psychologist, and whereas in cognitive science, it's a multidisciplinary approach where you have philosophers, linguists, computer scientists, psychologists, neuroscientists. So it adopts a multiple disciplinary approach. The other difference between these two approaches is that the aspect of mental processes that we study. Cognitive science, because it's a multidisciplinary field, it examines different, various aspects of human mind. And then we get a bigger picture of what cognition is, how the human mind works, by putting together the workings of human mind from multiple perspectives. So for this unit 4.1b, we're going to compare the information processing approach with the cognitive science approach. First, we'll talk about the information processing approach by specifically, we'll look at the assumptions of the information processing approach. And to that end, we'll actually look at one of the most influential memory model provided by Atkinson and Schifrin. And by going over that model, it gives a better understanding of the assumptions specific to strict information processing approach. And once we understand the specific assumptions of this IP approach, then we'll talk about the problems with this approach. And then we'll talk about how these were addressed by making revisions to the IP approach, which resulted in the current approach called the cognitive science approach. So we'll talk about the assumptions of the IP model first. Again, we're talking about the assumptions of the IP approach. Now we can just list the assumptions, but a better way would be to actually show the assumptions in action by looking at one of the prominent models at that time when there was the strict information processing approach. We looked at that model and how that model was used and how we can infer the assumptions of the information processing approach based on that particular model. And the model I'm referring to is in 1950s, end of 50s and beginning of 60s, Atkinson and Shiffrin proposed a model called the Atkinson-Shiffrin's memory model. It's also called the three-component model because according to this model, there are three components of the memory. One is the sensory memory, short-term memory, and the third one is long-term memory. That's why it's called a three-component memory model as well. Now, if you remember the definition of cognition, after the cognitive psychology was established, we had a better definition. If you remember, we defined it as a coordinated action of active mental processes within a multi-component memory system. Well, according to Atkinson and Shiffrin, this multi-component system is comprised of three components: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term. Now, this model is also called a modal model. A modal model is like an example model that actually portrays, first of all, it was very influential at that point, and also because it clearly portrays the assumptions of the then prevalent model, the IP approach, or the then prevalent approach, the information processing approach. Again, I want you to clearly understand the subtle distinction between strict IP approach and IP approach. We follow IP approach, the basic IP approach, even now, despite the fact that we're using cognitive science approach. What we don't follow now is a strict information processing approach. And that strict information processing approach, what the assumptions were of that approach is what we'll talk now about. Now, if you look at this, there are three components here: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. These memory components are represented as boxes. And you can see the arrow marks here. This is the stimulus information from outside. It goes to your sensory memory. From the sensory memory, it goes through a process called attention. Then the information goes to short-term memory. And the short-term memory goes through a controlled processes, which will search through long-term memory and retrieve information and give the output. Now, this is too much information. If not, if it is, you'll be fine. Let's look at an example. Let's say I show you a string of letters and say the string of letters is MAT. And you have to decide if it's a word or a non-word. So these printed letters first enter your sensory system. In this case, it's the vision, eyes, right? So your eyes capture the printed letters MAT. Now you focus on this, right? And this information, focused information, goes to your short-term. In the short-term memory goes through some control processes. In other words, it goes through some process such as it will search the long-term memory for anything similar to Matt. Then it retrieves the product of the search. So you have an image of Matt, the word Matt in your short-term memory. Then you have retrieved a representation of the word Matt from your long-term memory. Then you compare these two. Then you make a decision and say, yes, it's actually a word. Then you respond saying yes or no. So this is like you can see the directional nature of the process, right? And you can also see that the short-term memory goes through several control processes like searching, retrieving, comparing the searched information with the stored information, and then yes or no. Now, now what we'll do now, this is a memory model, right? I'm going to refer to memory model as memory model. And there is another term here called process model. Now, the difference between a memory, again, we're talking about the same Atkinson Shiffrin model, memory model, but in order to test a model, we convert a memory model into a process model. Now, if you look at this particular point here, the memory structures are represented as boxes. In a memory model, that's how typically they are. And the arrow marks, not always, but usually represent the processes, not the boxes, not the memory systems, but the actual processes. Well, this will be opposite. It'll be different in the process model. I'll talk about what a process model is in the next slide, and then we'll talk about, then we'll adapt this model. Um, and again, keep in mind the memory model and process model one the same. Memory model is a general model about the memory systems involved. A process model is a modified specific model. I'll talk more about it. Okay, so let's see how a process model is slightly different from the memory model. If you look at this particular thing, right, this is a memory model, and what you see here is a process model. Now, as you can see, the boxes here represent memory structures, right? The boxes here doesn't represent memory structures. It describes stages of processes, not structures of memory, but they are processes. For instance, information first needs to be encoded, right? So the encoding the word, let's again, this is different for different tasks. So that's why this is a task specific model, whereas a memory model is a general model, right? Task specific is in the sense like these are the mental process that you go through in a given task. Here, the task we're talking about is the lexical decision task. Again, we'll talk more about this task in the next slide. But if you remember the task, remember what you did. I said that imagine I show you this letters M-A-T, right? You have to decide whether it's a word or a non-word. Well, first thing that happens is that the information gets encoded, right, into your sensory memory. But the encoding also takes place here at the short-term memory. So what is the first kind of process we are referring to is encoding stimulus. Once the information goes to short-term memory, right, the short-term memory actually does some control processes. What does it do? It searches long-term memory and it returns the search to short-term memory. So search, retrieval is all incorporated in the search process. So encoding, search, and the next part is it makes a decision. It makes a decision by comparing the image that's retrieved from the long-term memory and comparing it with the image that's received from the sensory memory. So the decision here refers to the comparing and deciding parts. Then the individual responds saying yes or no. Again, this is a decision given out to the response. So if you can see the boxes here are not memory structures. These are the specific processes or the mental processes specific to the lexical decision task. We'll talk more about that in the next slide. So do you see the similarity and all the slight difference between these two models? A process model is specific to a task. If it's a different task, let's say 22 times 33 or multiplication, now the task would be different. The stages would be different. The processes would be different. So it would be different for different tasks. So that's why a process model is more specific than a memory model. Boxes in the process model represent processes at various memory systems. So you can define process model as a particular instance of a mental process in a given task. So a process model is a particular instance of a memory model about a specific mental process, and it is very specific to a given task. So now we'll try to adapt this process model and run through a task called lexical decision task. And by looking at the results of the lexical decision task, we'll try to understand how a model is used to make inference of the mental process, number one. Number two, to also kind of talk about the basic assumptions of information processing approach. That was the main reason why we are talking about this, right? Assumptions of IP approach, in fact, strict IP approach. Okay, so this task is called the lexical decision task. Lexical meaning word, lexicon, dictionary, word. Lexical is related to the word. Decision is you're making a decision. So it's a task of making a decision about whether or not a string of letters is a word. So participants typically are presented with a string of letters like this, like TEAM, right? It's a team. MARAT, Marat, or CRATE, whatever, great, whatever it is. Now, these are strings of letters. When these are presented to participants, participants had to decide. These are presented one at a time, one string of letter at a time, right? Then the participant at each string of letters have to decide whether it's a word or a non-word. If it's a word, they would say yes. If it's not a non-word, it's a non-word, they say no. So if I show you team, you would say yes. If I show you Murad, you would say no. Great, you would say yes. And what is measured in this task is the response time taken to decide as a function of whatever the manipulation is, but the DV is the response time. Now, what we're going to do now in the next slide is give you a list of strings of letters one at a time, and you have to decide and participate with me here. Just try to answer this, try to decide whether it's a word or not by saying yes or no as quickly as you can as we go through these slides. Okay? Okay, so I'm going to run through the slides. I want you to say out loud yes or no. You ready? As quickly as you can. And try to be aware of the time you take. Okay. So I'm going to pause here. Then I'll read it on and come back to this particular slide so we can talk about what just happened. So, so what just happened was you were presented with a string of letters and you had to decide whether a string of letter was either a word or a non-word, and we measure the reaction time or response time we took for each word. Of course, I didn't do this, but this is a typical lexical decision task experiment. So the task itself is a lexical decision task where the participants will decide whether a string of letters is a word or a non-word. The researchers manipulated in this example is the frequency. Again, there will be lots of words. I just showed you few words here, a few strings of letters. The IV, what was manipulated was a frequency word, whether it was a frequent word or an infrequent word or a control word. For instance, a word like office is a frequent word. A word like Robin is an infrequent word. And a word like Manti is a control non-word. And in this experiment, to just try to see if the reaction time overall for words like Robin and words like office or motor are different from a non-word like Manti, which is one is a frequent word, one is an infrequent word, how these are words are different from non-words in terms of the time taken to respond. So the IV is the frequency, the DV is the reaction or response time. Let's look at the results. Now, in terms of the model itself, remember there are different processes here, right? Encoding, search, decision, and response. On average, it took 650 milliseconds. Again, it was not just for one word like Robin, but this is it's actually for several words that were frequent, right? So I showed you a few words, but there were several other words participants saw. An average of all those words reaction time was 650 milliseconds. And when you compare that to this is an infrequent word, right? When you compare that to a non-word, which is a control word here, is 700 milliseconds, right? So it is faster than a non-word, but again, not too much different. 700 milliseconds average. This is again average of all non-words. And if you compare it to office, which is a more frequent word, it's faster, right? So the infrequent words were responded to, the reaction time was more when compared to the control words. And for the frequent words, the reaction time was much less, 650, 550, and 700. Now, here's the question. If encoding, search, decision, and response are the processes you go through when you make a lexical decision. Now, the question now is, where is this difference coming from? This difference of 550 milliseconds and 600, there is a difference of 100 milliseconds between a frequent and infrequent word, right? Where can you attribute this difference to? Now, just think about it. Do you think the encoding in your sensory stimulus would take different sensory memory would take different time as a function of whether it's a word or a non-word or whether it's a frequent or a non-frequent word? I don't think so, right? Let's come back to search. Do you think the search itself would take a long time if it's a word, frequent word versus a non-frequent word? Maybe, right? Once you've searched and brought the search result to the short-term memory, do you think the decision would take longer for the frequent versus non-frequent words or non-frequent versus frequent words? I don't think so, right? When the search result is back, it's easy to compare, right? And make a decision. And once a decision is made, you just have to say yes or no. That should not again matter. So the kind of inference now we can draw is that the most likely difference you see between a non-frequent or infrequent word and a frequent word reaction time is mostly because of the search process. Searching a frequent word takes less time when compared to searching an infrequent. So that could be the reason why, that would be one reason why the frequent words were responded to faster when compared to the infrequent words. So this is how you make inferences about the mental process. That the frequent words or frequently frequent words are more easily accessible. So taking less time to search for them when compared to more frequent. Now, in the next particular, I want you to keep this in mind. And in the next slide, we're going to talk about the assumptions underlying the AP or the IP approach, information processing approach, based on what we have discussed so far. When we go to the next slide, we'll talk about the assumptions of the information processing approach. Now this is like thinking backwards in a way. Now that we know that there is a difference and how we have inferred about the reason for this difference, now this is based on the assumption of the memory model and the process model that resulted from the. Now, what do you think the assumptions are of that model? Just think about it, pause here for a second, and think about when you come back. You can look at here my take on it. Well, I hope you've tried to think about it. One thing is that one assumption of the memory model is that the processes are sequential. In other words, first encoding happens, then the search happens, then the decision happens, then the response. Or if you're talking about the memory systems itself, sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, right? So it's not parallel. Parallel is multiple processes happening at the same time. Sequential is one after another. In other words, there are no overlapping stages of processing. This process and this process don't overlap. That's one assumption. The um, Another assumption is that the earlier stages are independent of later stages. Now, when you say earlier stages are independent of later stages, it means two things here. Number one, for any given word, the encoding of that word has nothing to do with the response that you will have for that word. Well, it's logical, right? There's no other way. But before encoding, how can you even have a response, right? So the response for this word should not affect the encoding of the same word, which make complete sense. But it also means one more important thing here. The thing is that let's say you have encoded Robin, right? And you went through the process of response, then you're going to a next word. Okay. Now, this next word earlier stage, which is encoding, it is independent of the response you have given to the previous word. That also refers to earlier stages are independent of later stages. In other words, the later stages of one word should not influence the encoding of or the earlier stages of the next word. I hope it makes sense. Well, there are problems with these assumptions, and that's what we'll talk about in the next video. Sorry, next slide. Okay, so this brings us to the next outcome, which is the problems with the information processing approach. Now, in this one, we're going to quickly go over some problems with the model. That there are two assumptions, right? One is that the things are sequential, first, second, sequentially, one after the other. No two processes can occur at the same time. That may refer to the same word and also different words. Let's say you're reading a word, you've made a response to that, right? When you are reading another word or a string of letters, then you are encoding it, right? And responding to it. The idea is that no two processes can overlap. So one after the other is sequential. So there is that one problem with this is that there is enough evidence for the parallel processing. In fact, the imaging studies have shown that more than one area of the brain is used in processing a word in a specific task. So there is evidence for parallel processing. Well, think of another example. If you're a fast typer, if you type fast, you'll probably understand this. Is when you're actually reading, you won't even look at the keyboard, right? If you're a good typist, you probably just read the thing and type. Now think about it. What you're reading and what you're typing, right? If they are sequential, so you should read a word, say doctor, you process it, then you should type doctor, then you should take the new word. That's what sequential non-overlapping also means. But that's not what happens if you think about it. If you're really good at things, you are typing the first sentence while you're reading the second sentence. In other words, you're encoding the second sentence while you're responding to the first sentence. In other words, those two parts are happening at the same time, which again is an evidence against the assumption of sequential processing. So there is one problem is that there is parallel processing evidence. In the next slide, we'll talk about the evidence of context effect, which contradicts the second assumption. The second assumption is that later stages will not influence the earlier stages of processing. In other words, responding to a word should not affect how you would encode the next word. We'll talk about the context of in a second. Let me show you the task before. Now, let's look at this. If I just showed you this particular image, what would you say it is? It could be B or 13. Now, you can say that because I'm providing both the images here. What typically happens is that the same image would be interpreted as a number or as an alphabet, depending on the information that you processed before. So if you actually processed letters and you were shown this, you are more likely to say it's a number. If you processed alphabets and then you were shown this image, the same image, you're more likely to say it's B. In other words, what you have processed or responded to, the later stages, would influence your earlier stages of encoding this information, which is nothing but context effect. Context effect is the interpretation of an object depends on the context in which you are processing it. If you're processing it in the context of numbers, you interpret it as a letter number. Is evidence against the second assumption. The second assumption is that later stages, let's say the stage one, these are sequential, right? Right. Later stages of processing for word one should not influence the processing of the second word. So this is exactly what is happening here. Your encoding of information of this image would be different if you processed an alphabet versus a number. Now, there are several other issues. The commonly discussed issues are um, that when you think about higher cognitive functions like reasoning, problem solving, it is hard to explain, assuming that you process information sequentially and that later stages would not influence the earlier stages. Because you do multiple things at the same time, or multiple kinds of things at the same time, if not a given thing. For instance, if let's say you are, I don't know if you ever work at a restaurant, and especially the ones where you are like a um, Starbucks or something, and so the drive-through. Just imagine what goes on in your mind where you are interacting with the person who's giving you an order, but you're also interacting with the person who has already ordered. Now, if you think about a sequential processing thing, it would take forever. It's as if you are managing multiple things, which does not mean multitasking, but because we'll talk about this later, but the idea is that a completely sequential processing does not explain more complex tasks our mind does. So that's another problem with this approach is that it cannot explain more complex tasks if you assume that our processing is sequential. Well, this brings us to the last outcome for this particular video, and it is what are the specific revisions that are made to the strict information processing approach that led to a revised approach called the cognitive science approach. The revisions are, well, pause here for a second and think about how these two models are different. This is the standard model, the one we discussed, Atkinson and Shiffrin model. It's also called standard model or the model model or the three-component model. Now, this is a modified model. How are they different? Pause here for a second, then come back. Well, I hope you have thought about it. How is it different? If you see here, one difference is that the directions of all these arrows are unidirectional, right? Only because it's sequential assumption, right? Memory model assumed that things are sequential. Well, what was modified was that these are not necessarily only unidirectional. You can see these arrows changing to multi-bidirectional. In other words, there can be influence of this on this also, right? There can be influence of this on this and also this on this. There can be, so that's what the bidirectional nature. So the bidirectional nature of the arrow marks is one big change. What other changes have you noticed? You're right, yes. There is a connection between long-term memory and short-term memory, which you haven't seen here, right? So there are some additional connections. It's bidirectional, and also there are some additional connections connecting long-term and sensory memory that shows that there can be a direct connection influencing sensory memory, influencing long-term memory, or long-term memory influencing sensory memory, because that's bidirectional also. Well, that brings us to the end of this particular topic. Again, remember, reason why we've been talking about this is we're talking about, so far in these two videos, we talked about cognitive science, the approaches of strict information processing approach and cognitive science approach, how they're different, how they're similar, and we try to understand what specifically is different between IP and cognitive science approach. We said that the basic assumption of sequential nature of the processing and the later stages influencing the earlier stages is a big thing. Those things change and result in the new approach called the cognitive science approach. Also keep in mind that the cognitive science approach and information processing approach both have the same three basic fundamental meta theory or assumption that mental processes exist, they can objectively study mental processes, and that we are information processing systems. The subtle differences are that we don't assume that things are sequential anymore. We don't assume that later stages don't affect earlier stages. In addition to that, we have made cognitive science a more multidisciplinary approach where there are additional methodologies added, like the ones we discussed: protocol, verbal protocols, the computer programming, and physiological or neuroscience methodologies. All right. So now that we talked about general methodologies and how we move from IP to cognitive science approach, now it's time to specifically talk about one approach called the cognitive neuroscience approach. So in the next video, we'll talk about cognitive neuroscience approach. Thank you very much. Stay tuned and have fun learning.